Welcome to all our attendees. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. And thank you for joining today's webinar with AX for Pharma. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar, and if you have one, please post it in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen below. Attendees will be on mute throughout the webinar, and today I'd like to introduce the team who will be here from AX for Pharma. So we have Andrea Rossi, who's the CEO, Pete Martin, the Chief Growth Officer, and Massimo Crudeli, who's the Director of Client Solutions. So I'll hand over to you now, Andrea, and take my camera off, and you can kick off the presentation.
Thank you, Cheryl. And Cheryl is our marketing manager. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea Rossi. I'm the CEO of AX for Pharma. One brief description of our company and our solutions. So AX for Pharma has been focused only on pharmaceutical, biotech, medical device manufacturing, distribution, implementation, and validation based on Microsoft Dynamics ERP for 14 years now. We are based in the US and in Europe, certified. In pharmaceutical and biotech, it's important to be certified. So Gold Partner, ISO 2001 certified for many years, and other certifications. What we do, multinational ERP implementations for life sciences, mainly biotech and pharma, but also medical devices, specialty chemicals, cosmetics, and so on, but mainly medical, biotech and pharma. Not just implementations, but starting from best practices and from accelerators, so not starting from scratch. And it is, as a differentiator, we also offer computer system validation services and computer software assurance. The services are maintaining and a software system validated. From a more going up in the services offering, business process optimization, and industry-specific management consulting, including, for example, for clinical supplies, manufacturing and distribution. Differentiators, what we believe makes us unique, offering support for GMP, GXP, so good manufacturing, clinical, laboratory, distribution practices, and SOX 404 as well. So there's about over 80% overlap, and our solutions and our methodologies try to offer as much as possible of both. We don't do CPA consulting, let's call it CPA consulting or Final Four consulting. That would be a pure SOX 404 company. But from an ERP implementation perspective, many of the requirements, separation of duties, and so on are the same. And so we tend to offer one unique implementation approach and methodology. We work with Microsoft. We're working for many, many years with Microsoft, including, for example, being part of a program called RVP, Release Validation Program, that allows to test our solution before Microsoft comes up with a new version, even before the beta is distributed, to make sure that solutions that are produced remain compliant and functioning in the cloud with every new release. Going to modules is not just ERP, it includes operations, of course, finance, laboratory information management system, weighing and dispensing, including manufacturing execution system, clinical supplies and clinical trials, pre-commercial and commercial. So very unique aspect is that we can cover with the same solution both pre-commercial activities and then once the product is approved, the commercialization, production, distribution, and advanced warehouse management, including handheld devices, barcode labels, barcode label printers, and so on. This is, again, it's been our experience for the longest time. And the last step, but very, very critical, and this is part of our discussion today, automated testing. So we offer automated testing for cloud ERP implementations and in general for enterprise systems that need to be maintained compliant in the cloud. So we're in the cloud now. This is the trend. Today, everybody's moving to the cloud. There are many, many reasons. We're not going to address them now. But do we maintain the control we need from a validation perspective? Once we address those questions, we can make some recommendations for how to achieve and maintain the cloud compliance, including with the continuous upgrades that are required, and then possible next steps in Q&A. So the biggest thing about the cloud is that we don't control the upgrade cycles and the process. It is determined by the vendor, it's communicated to the market, it's adapted to our industry, the pharma and biotech industry, but we don't control it. We have to adapt our risk assessment procedures our validation procedures, our documentation procedures, and even organizational change management in case of changes to what vendors tell us. So first of all, it's important to choose the right vendor. We'll see it later, but also to fit what we know is a very specific need for our industry into the vendor's offering. This is the difficult match. If a vendor says, I upgrade 8 times a year, Microsoft, then we know it's not possible. But I can skip one every 3, or sorry, 3 every 3 upgrades. How does that fit with what is required by GAM5 to achieve and maintain a validated state? That's the core question to ask. Part of this, as you hear, is maintaining records for every test. That's a big part of it, but there are other aspects as well. So we have to perform continuous validation in a compliant manner to make sure that the system remains fit for its intended purpose. And when we are audited, that we have the evidence that we are in control and that we are, making sure we are looking at patient safety and minimizing risk at all costs. So product quality, patient safety is all that matters for these operations, these upgrades. Everything else is a consequence. Going to how to maintain the ERP system in this validated state. There are many aspects. We'll see many later, but the 3 core ones from our perspective are risk, and we'll see it later also opportunity assessment. It's called risk assessment because, of course, we have to always minimize risk. The objective is to produce medicines, therapeutics that are safe, implemented in a compliant way, and that heal and do not in any way adversely affect our patients or subjects. How do we maintain this? There are multiple upgrades per year with cloud solutions. Again, an example we have today, Microsoft 8 per year. And so how do we minimize this risk while upgrading? Because that's a technical requirement, and it's also bringing a lot of value for the companies, new features, more stable solution, addressed to maybe issues that are addressed, and so on. The other point is configuration management. So one is risk assessment. How do I assess the impact of the change on my implementation? The second one, how do I document my configuration, and how do I document changes potentially to configuration? The configuration will change through time. As part of GAM5, Good Automated Manufacturing Practices, we need to document the configuration. It's called Configuration Specification Document. This is a very laborious effort in ERP implementations, and it can be hundreds and hundreds of pages, depending on the level of depth we want to do in this configuration documentation. It's a big deal. Again, it's nothing to do with testing, but it's also a requirement, just like a risk assessment. The last one is regression testing, which is often a blend of manual and automated testing. So every time you do an upgrade, things change. So once I assess what has changed, I still need to confirm that the system is working according to its intended use. And that means performing testing, which can be manual, automated, a combination typically, and it produces evidence. And the evidence also has to be verified. So we've seen, for example, in some projects with automated testing, we'll see it in a minute, that once you produce dozens or hundreds of pages of evidence, someone still has to review it, sign off on the evidence. For example, to check the false negatives. False positives are fine. I think there's a mistake, but there's not. That's great. It's better to have tighter controls, especially if they're automated, so they're not costly for the quality assurance team. But the challenge is, what if an error is there and for some reason our test didn't catch it? We still need to do a review. In that case, we also have suggestions on how to do this, recommendations on how to minimize the effort of the quality assurance team. As Cheryl said at the beginning, we'll open to questions at the end, but if you'd like to post them in the chat in the meantime, please do, and we'll address them at the end. Going forward a little bit more in detail, so this is talking about risk assessment for frequent updates. This is a plan of upgrades from Microsoft from December 2021 till January 2023. This is just an excerpt of what is being done. And as you see, we're already at version 21. And we have version 21 to 30, since we have 8 versions per year. The versions per year, this is 9 because it's December to January. All these versions have documentation on when the preview, it's called the beta, will be available, when a customer can self-update, and when we are forced to update. So part of the recommendation from a vendor should be, how do I determine a cadence for these upgrades, not only between versions, but also within one version? How do I keep the timing, given that within this timing, I have to add validation? One step is here before, and where it's not written, this is operational documentation, is called RVP. We are part of RVP, but it's just an example. Release validation program is a pre-PEEP version. It's, let's say, alpha. If this is the beta, the RVP is the alpha. And our solution is preventively test to verify that it maintains compliance with what Microsoft offers. This is critical to make sure confirming this compliance as quickly as possible to give elapsed time to the quality assurance team to do the checks. Okay, regarding the rules, it's 2 tests per year. So minimum 2 upgrades per year. There are companies like Viva. I'm sure you know Viva is the leader in biopharma enterprise software. They force, let's say 3. They do 3 per year. So 1 average every 4 months. Microsoft recommends it requires at least 2 per year, and we have to again time them to make sure we have the time to do the actual validation, and that the internal quality assurance of a customer has the time to do that. As a note, this is obvious, but it's always important to point it out. Each update has new functionalities, enhancements of existing functionalities to complete something completely new. Solutions that exist that are enhanced, and bug fixes. Okay, all 3 can impact the process. Even completely new functionalities, like we're implementing right now, a pretty new module that Microsoft introduced about a year ago. Is called engineering change management. It's actually product data management, product lifecycle management light. And there are nuances in creating centralized data that then is propagated across multiple companies. So that could bring a change of process, and all that will probably not have test scripts. So we have to create new test scripts. But at the same time, if we did product release in a different way, then we have to take those existing test scripts, adapt them, or execute them anyway. If there's a bug fix, that's fine, but I still have to test it. Maybe we raised it. Maybe we have a manual control. Maybe, and this is a big point, maybe your vendor implemented a fix, a patch for the bug fix, and once Microsoft introduces the fix to the solution, the vendor has to track the fix and remove the one they implemented. So all these little nuances have to be noted. They have a sort of rhythm, which is very different from the past one, where instead we were upgrading every 1, 2, 3 years in pharma especially. Last point, the updates are both technical. This is what is called IQ, installation qualification, and functional. So processes, functionalities. The technical ones, as an example, Microsoft a while ago upgraded the control for grid control. So if you have a grid, the newer one is much nicer, it looks better. You can move around columns and things like that. So it's more functional. You can add sums at the bottom. But previously created tests did not always work against that new control. So from a technical perspective, there's a change like that. We need to assess if controls of any type, a button, a radio button, a new button, a menu item, a date field, a numeric field, an alphanumeric field, if they still work. So one check that needs to be performed is if the foundation of the application is still functioning properly. That's a preliminary round of testing that we recommend always in order to upgrade. Going to risk assessment, we added opportunity here because it's not just a risk assessment. So can a change impact product quality and patient safety? That's fine. That's critical. But we also have to check our opportunities. So we can identify, for example, new business improvement opportunities, leveraging new features and modules, the example I just gave. At the same time, of course, risk mitigation is critical, risk assessment and mitigation. And this has to be a combination of manual and automated activities. The manual activities typically go through looking at release notes of the vendor, the principal vendor, in our case, of course, Microsoft, the release notes of ISVs, independent software vendors that provide additional solutions, and customizations. Maybe something we customized does not work anymore because something by Microsoft was deprecated. We need to find that. We need to assess it. And apart from reading the release notes, there are ways, this is something, for example, that we offer, there are ways to control the code. So check the code of version, let's say 21 versus version 25. And if there are changes that are very deep changes, so let's say we see 200 changes in the area of warehouse management, a recommendation could be let's do a full regression testing in that area because Microsoft evidently has been enhancing a lot. And then we need to check that. So we typically, in our approach, but this is a general for any ERP, we cross-reference the changes from the vendor, the release notes from the vendor, technical changes, the release notes, put them together, and then offer a full risk assessment. And this is what needs to be done by anyone. We also track, as you see here, all the changes by Microsoft. And for each one, for each customer, we assess if that change we believe has an impact on them. Configuration management. We're going now from risk assessment to configuration management. Based on the complexity of the project, let's call them standard, medium complexity, complex, and even bigger. As you see here, complex, they can be multiple environments. Some are controlled and some are not. And in pharma, of course, controlled means we need to track every change in the environment, every configuration, every technical change, if we're linking Power BI, if we're linking Power Automate, and so on and so on. So this configuration is tracking these environments is tricky because apart from having the environments themselves, if we make a change in typically sandbox and then propagate it to validation and propagate it to production and so on, we have to track those changes through a process called change control. Typically, this is done manually. Some solutions have a formal promotion mechanism, meaning that a set of configurations can be taken, you press a button, it's moved to another environment and it's controlled. Microsoft has some of this, not quite. So we added two features, but this is, again, what's needed in these applications to generate what's called the configuration specification. On one side, all evidence of the database, and this is for any enterprise system. We need to document how it's set up. What are my units of measure? What are my countries, for example, or environments or companies, and so on. The big change is what if I then do a setup and clone it, for example, for another company? Many of our customers are large multinationals that have dozens of companies. So a new legal entity could leverage the configuration for the existing environment legal entity. It can be copied manually or automatically. If it's a little bit of code, we do it typically manually and then have to document it. If it's a lot of not code but data, we then do it through a control process, but especially we need to show evidence of the changes. So if environment A is the validation environment, I do all my tests and everything is perfect. And then we have a user, even if it's manual, that goes in the production environment and does 20 changes in the setup. How do I track that? The typical approach, which is usually still needed, is called change control. Take a screenshot, do the change. But an additional approach is show me a document comparing the two environments, giving me a full trace of the differences. And maybe they're applicable. Maybe there's a payment method in the US, which is 30 days. And in Italy, this is unluckily true, it's 90 days. So I don't want to have both. So I have only 30 days for the US, only 90 in Italy. And the system will compare the two and inform me of the changes. So I can track a controlled kernel and then propagate it around the world. This type of activity, we're talking about dynamics in our product, but in general, it applies to any solution that we're tracking. And configuration control is critical. This is an example of an output. Actually, this is, again, talking about code. We went from 22,000 pages the first time we were documenting the configuration to about 2,000, and we're reducing it further, while the configuration comparison is a few dozen document pages at least. So the first one, again, for compliance is needed, it needs to be signed off and so on. And instead, the comparison is the actual practical document. Those of you that have implemented ERP, that especially Dynamics, you know that if you have a multi-company environment, you start from one and say, okay, did I copy the shipment methods, for example? And then you see CIF, X factory in one, and then you have 3 in the other one. Okay, which one's correct? But at least with this tool, we save a lot of time and a lot of headaches because we don't have to worry. Of the hundreds of tables, did I track them all? And the tool will help us. So these type of solutions is coming from the experience of upgrading solutions many times. and coming up to generating the deliverables which are needed in our industry. And now this is the pièce de résistance, I think, in French. So regression testing. The heart of it is the operational qualification, the performance qualification. In our industry, we need to upgrade environments, and to maintain it validated, we are required to do regression testing. Regression testing is typically a combination of manual and automated testing. For the configuration changes, we also need to check the configuration change. And this is a little tricky because we can check the process, but in some cases, it depends on the customer. In our industry, typically, you would also test the process of configuring the system. Some companies do that. Others clearly separate configuration from the actual process testing and re-execute the process testing. The configuration is tracked for change control. Not only it needs to be executed, but of course documented. So the trend now, of course, many of us still do it manually, and there's always will be a manual component, but it's high resource demand. It creates a lot of demand of resources when we do it only manually. So this is why the FDA is strongly recommending with CSA, Computer Software Assurance, instead of Computer System Validation, CSV, is recommending to introduce automated testing. There is risk also in automated testing. The automated testing tool needs to be validated. Of course, it cannot see everything, so it needs to be controlled and one needs to be signed off on it. But ultimately, the most efficient mix, the trend of the industry is going to a blend of automated and manual testing to perform this activity. And again, reliability test results, we have seen that if the tests are done manually, there may be human errors. Maybe some data is missing. So we have a deviation that wouldn't have been there because the computer is consistent. If it's done automatically, we need to introduce checkpoints to make sure that the computer was actually performing properly. So one is actually validating the tool itself. And that's critical. But the other one is maybe having queries or having other types of checks or high-level exploratory or end-to-end testing done by humans manually to combine with the automated testing and giving the best possible result. The whole point is lower costs, but maintaining quality and safety. So this is really the key of it. And this is an example of a solution. So benefits of automated testing, faster and more frequent execution, obviously. The results are more precise. The results we have are more precise, but the tool needs to be validated because we have to confirm the results are accurate. And again, the execution is faster and automated. So the question here becomes, do I execute it all the time, even though nothing changes? Maybe to track changes in configuration, because sometimes we see that in perfectly good faith, users maybe make a small change, but it was not documented. It can happen. It should never happen, but it can happen. And automated testing can actually capture that for us. So test more frequently, reducing risk, staying compliant, and supporting the overall validation and software assurance process. So again, this test more frequently. We have to determine, for example, that we're considering with some customers. Do we test an upgrade on a version that we are not going to implement? Can we do it in a non-validated way because we're not implementing that version, but still use it as a beta version of the upgrade to see if that version in any case impacts us? It is a trade-off, but it's a way maybe saying instead of doing the whole work every 3-4 versions, we do a little bit every version as automated as possible, and then do the real effort with all the documentation, all the evidence we need, release notes and everything done with the really validated version. So we're looking at these blended approaches, and everybody has their strategy, but having seen different approaches to this, we can make recommendations based on how strong the internal quality assurance team is. Strong meaning not in capacity, in capability, but in capacity. How many headcounts? And then maybe even outsource that. So it's important to assess with a partner, can the partner do it for you? The last point, data sets. So iterating across data sets. For example, we have drug product, drug substance, API, dispensable unit, kit. This is talking about a case where it's clinical supplies. Maybe it's fine to test just for one item, but there are little nuances for each one of them. And maybe creating the multiple versions, since it's automated, it gives us the opportunity of testing all the combinations of products. If we do it manually, probably we'll test 1 or 2. So recommendations. how to assess if the combination of vendor and implementation partner, often the vendor is different from the implementation partner. Sometimes it's the same. Microsoft, by design, goes indirectly. So Microsoft maybe does 1% of the projects worldwide. So first of all, assess a partner's life sciences expertise for any software. This is not just ERP, it's for any software in our industry, life sciences, biotech, pharma, and so on. So partners don't understand GXP, good manufacturing practices, laboratory practices, distribution practices, clinical practices, and so on. How our processes need to be implemented, or how to implement validation in the cloud or out of the cloud. So this doesn't mean that a partner that doesn't understand this is not a viable partner. But if the selection is a partner who doesn't understand this, then you need to add another partner that does understand this, that can sort of chaperone them or coach them, or be a connection between you and the partner. It doesn't matter, but it's just something to be aware of. You can do it with maybe a local partner is very strong in local GAAP, local finances, speaks the language. It would be fine, for example, to work with them for all the non-GMP aspects, and then having a partner that gets it only for those processes. As a solution, so this is the partner's expertise. Going to the solution, ERP out of the box is not made for pharma. It just isn't, none of them. And even if they do cover some pharmaceutical processes and biotech processes, they do not include all the necessary components. So there are very few ERPs, for example, that have a LIMS module. And then all the discussion, best of breed, best practices. But best of breed and best practices, meaning multiple solutions have to speak with each other, require either validating the whole thing every time, so validating all the solutions at the same time, putting a tremendous burden on the shoulders of the quality assurance department, or we can validate one at a time, but then have to revalidate the interfaces on both sides. So it's, again, trade-off. I'm not recommending, we have an offering which is integrated, but it's not a recommendation. Some companies want best of breed. They want the best QMS in the whole world, the best LIMS in the whole world, the best ERP in the whole world, and then somehow stitch them together. That's the strategy. It's called best of breed. Best practices is take one end-to-end solution, not have to manage the interfaces, but maybe feature-wise, they're not as deep. These are considerations to make when you're moving to the cloud or implementing cloud solutions and trying to keep them validated. So ultimately, another point here is the validation process is often not automated. And so cloud compliance, technology, solution, software, there are different pieces of this. We'll describe them in a minute. One of them, as we saw, is very important, is automated testing. But as I said, automated documentation for the configuration. Another one could be automated documentation to some degree for risk assessment. Another component is application lifecycle management. We need a backend to store user requirements, test scripts, traceability matrix. All these pieces need to be put together, supporting the ERP implementation and validation. And this is not ERP itself, it's corollary to the ERP implementation. So going a little bit more in detail, first of all, the partner ideally should have proven industry expertise, references, experience, certifications, and so on. Again, ideally having a life sciences practice and vertical focus. It's difficult to assess that because one aspect is the marketing aspect, one aspect is imbuing these values, the values that are needed to implement properly in our industry. I personally moved to pharma because I was accused of doing over quality in ERP implementations, and I could not lower the standards of what we're doing. So instead, I found a niche where that was needed every single time. So that vertical focus is a quality focus. It's a focus on standards. It's a focus on the actual knowledge of the processes, and ultimately dedicated resources. So it's difficult for one person to do one-time retail, one-time, industrial equipment, and then one time doing farm. It's just a different mindset. It's really because the resources in our industry have to go slower, but higher quality. And of course, we want to be efficient. But in the other industries, it's okay to go quick. And then if we make a mistake, we'll fix it. In our case, a mistake can hurt someone if we make it just once. And experience with cloud implementation and validation. So this is a little bit unique because typically, partners that know the ERP often don't also have a validation practice. So in this case, you might need a third party. They're called IVD, Independent Verification and Validation Partners. Sometimes some customers choose to go that route. Sometimes they don't. They want to do everything with their quality assurance department. They're both valid, but this needs to be considered when implementing in life sciences. So going to solutions, and this is just a quick panoramic of the modules that we offer, but I won't go into detail. That's not the purpose of the presentation. So starting from the Microsoft platform with standard components. So these are all standard components. These are all Microsoft standard extensions that can be used for the Power Platform, Power Apps, Power Automate, and so on. But in the middle, and the Dataverse to integrate, but in the middle, there are vertical capabilities that no ERP offers. These capabilities can be covered by manual controls, expensive, and manual operations. They can be covered by buying third-party solutions, best of breed, completely viable approach. It's, again, has a different type of cost and different cadence, and different teams need to be skilled on how the different tools are customized, enhanced, and so on. Our philosophy was to take Dynamics and extend it for all these areas. So from the supply chain management in general to LIMS to clinical supplies. Some customers are pre-commercial companies, to advanced warehouse management, handheld devices, to weighing and dispensing. And ultimately, as I was saying, the cloud compliance suite, which is a little different because these are functional modules. This one helps us maintain the system validated. So forgetting our offering, but really, there's an enterprise software. Either it's purpose-made for the industry, and then it doesn't have the breadth of a Microsoft that gives us finance, supply chain, project management, asset management, resource planning, and so on and so on. Or we have a horizontal solution like Microsoft with all these incredible tools, but then we're missing the verticalized components. So our position was to build these components. They should be ideally category 4, especially in the cloud. So customization has always been a bad term in our industry. We want to configure, not customize. So GAM5 category 4 software, not GAM5 category 5. But at the same time, you may need enhancements. So the trade-off of customizing, maintaining the system validated versus taking off the shelf has to be analyzed. That's part of the organizational change management. Can I adapt to best practices, or am I so unique in some areas where the software has to adapt to me? This is part of what your advisor should be looking at, not just asking, what would you like to do, because they don't understand the requirement, and then just coding. Sometimes you don't get exactly what you need, but it's category 4. Somebody else tests it for you. So in that case, the benefit of having category 4 is that the vendor with COTS module is pre-testing it, delivering it, and is seamlessly part of the Microsoft offering, giving the best of all these worlds. Going to cloud compliance, I'll go on the right is the V model, but I'll go on the left on the areas that need to be covered, no matter what solution you're implementing. If it's LIMS, if it's ERP, NES, QMS, all these acronyms, quality management system, enterprise asset management in the life sciences industry. So the backbone of all this is an application lifecycle management. Microsoft, of course, offers Azure DevOps, and we use Azure DevOps. But whatever the backbone means, we need to track the URS, user requirements specification. We need to test the test scripts, which are a combination of manual and automated. We need to cross-reference them. That is the traceability matrix. And we need to add all the other ancillary information in the system to make it tracked and compliant. So in our case, for example, for data migration, just to make an example of additional documents, it's called the configuration workbook. It documents all the pieces that needs to be configured. And then we need to create the evidence of the configured system. That's the configuration specification. So going through here on the right, you start with validation plan, perform risk assessment. This is more iterative. We start with the URS that can be fine-tuned through time, decline them into functional requirement specification, and then go to the infrastructure, which is also required, go to the config spec, which is an output of all this configuration effort we make. Here, we're not adding the customized part. Down here in the GAM5 category 5 software, you would have the customized part. And then as an output, configuration comparison. And then we do the IQ, OQ, PQ, installation, operation, and performance qualification. and ultimately generate the trace matrix, which is cross-referencing the URS and the FRS, which are testing, with our evidence of our testing. The result of all this is our validation summary report. And here, again, this is us, but this applies to any project. Many of these aspects are automated and covered by different modules and offerings. So to recap it, apart from application lifecycle management and templates that can accelerate the validation, we have the key again is always a manual and automated testing, the correct combination, performing a periodic risk assessment. Microsoft changes version, we change version, other ISVs may change version. What has to be done to make sure that we check that the impact overall in the company of these changes? We need to possibly adapt the configuration, track it, document it, and last but not least, security management. This applies both to GMP and SOC 404, so separation of duties and so on, to make sure that we are controlled. In GMP, it's very important. One feature is second person verification. So in some cases, if we're changing a sensitive data, we don't want to just change it with one person. So typically it's done on paper externally. I want to change this. There's a form. Somebody says, okay, you can change that. The form goes through, and then the last user actually inserts that in the computer, changes the setup, and then documents the change. Instead, in our case, the initiation of the change is done in the ERP, triggering a request for change with another user. The other user makes the change, does the sign off, possibly with electronic signatures, but it's also 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, or European the Annex 11 compliance, same number for electronic signature in Europe, and then tracking who asked for the change, who released the change, potentially a reason code, why did I release it, and so on. So all these aspects together, and as you see, this is nothing to do with the functionality of an application. It's not even anything to do with ERP. They need to be considered. The tool that puts it all together is ALM. Again, Azure DevOps from Microsoft. There are other tools. If we have templates to start with, it's easier. Writing URS is difficult. Writing a proper user requirement, it is complicated. So if the vendor, partner, whoever has a set of ready-made URS, it can make your job easier, because at that point, instead of doing it from scratch, you can check the delta between what the company's needs are and what is offered out of the box. It's critical, especially the FDA is also supporting this, to not only have the manual testing we've always done, but also automated testing. And one part here is the CSA approach, computer software assurance, basically testing based on risk. So we didn't add this part just to keep the presentation streamlined, but there's a whole matrix that determines if the solution is customized, if the solution is COTS, if it's configurable COTS, or if it's just COTS non-configurable, so even more robust. And based on the impact, so does it affect patient safety? Does it affect product quality? Does it touch the product in any way, even tangentially? So for example, if I have a sales order or a purchase order, we can say, yeah, the price of the product touches the product, but it doesn't, because it has no impact. It has an impact on the well-being of the company, but it will not affect the customer, the patient, the subject, if we misprice the sales order. So in that case, that is not affecting it. And we have to check all this and test it and reduce the testing and test deeply the parts that are affecting the customers, partners, patients, subjects, clients. Okay. So next steps, and then I'll open to Q&A. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. First of all, of course, for the cloud, all our solutions are described at X4Pharma. The cloud compliance suite is specifically what I showed, the different pieces that need to be put together, one of which is automated testing, to maintain a compliant state in the most efficient way, but also effective, so high quality. And of course, we'd be happy to do a cloud compliance workshop to further address how we can help with, if you have typically Dynamics, but also other solutions. And if you're doing an upgrade, if you have an existing implementation, we're happy to, these are our contact information. Please reach out to us. There are also the emails, myself, Pete, Massimo, and we're available to connect. So that said, here are the emails. ARU, PMA, MCR, it's easy. And feel free to reach out to us, really. We would love to hear from you. And now, last, we have about 15 minutes for questions and opening up for any comments.
Thank you, Andrea. And for attendees on the call, if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat or ask them live. I do have a couple that came through via email, Andrea, if you don't mind. So the first one that I have is, will Microsoft accept an audit by a life sciences company?
So Microsoft typically doesn't accept audits from anybody. maybe the Department of Defense, with the Jedi bid, maybe that was the only exception. But Microsoft provides evidence of compliance status, not specifically for GMP, but confirming that the system has been controlled by third parties. It's done every quarter, I believe. And this documentation is available from Microsoft Trust and Compliance Center. And Microsoft provides white papers on the compliance of GxP guidelines, both for Dynamics and for Azure in general. And Microsoft does accept, of course, to interact with Microsoft team members, but as a policy, no large vendor accepts audits from third parties. They don't open their data centers.
All right, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then a final question I had was, will Microsoft allow life sciences companies to skip releases? So, for example, for a year, how might that work?
So Microsoft debated this a lot, and we were part of the discussions. Of course, not equally as Microsoft, but Microsoft asked for our contribution and many other partners. Ultimately landing on 8 releases per year. Uh-huh. So 2 per year is not exactly 1 every 6 months. It means 1, skip 3, 1, skip 3. So Microsoft allows to skip 3 at the most. All right. That's it. It's quite rigid. So the approach, and of course, if Microsoft were called directly by a customer, that can be a discussion. But our experience is that it's not possible to skip versions. And if it happens one time for one version, it's a very unique case. So typically, it just doesn't happen. So we have to work with the vendor, in this case, Microsoft, on timing all the work that we do to make sure that it goes with Microsoft releases. And that's why, for example, companies like Viva do 3 releases per year, not 2. Mm-hmm. One average every 4 months. And we're looking at the same thing. We give our customers the option of doing 2 or 3. It depends also on the project cadence, on go lives, and so on. And try to support with managed services offerings the actual validation effort to minimize the effort of the customer's internal quality assurance team.